It was 1:30 in the morning, on June 6, 1944. There was no moon to light the sky over Normandy. Pilots flew low over France with no landmarks to guide them. The world below was a black sheet torn open by sudden, violent bursts of German flak. The air smelled of cordite and the plane shuddered with explosions. Every flash of light was a threat, a sign someone on the ground knew they were coming. The mission had just begun and it was already going wrong. The first Americans over France that night were not there to fight. They were there to prevent a catastrophe. They were called Pathfinders. Their mission was simple on paper. Land ahead of the main force, mark drop zones with radar beacons and signal lights, guide the invasion in. Simple on paper, nearly impossible in practice. They had to land first, deep behind enemy lines. They had to find their designated fields in total darkness. Then they had to turn on special beacons, lay out signal lights on the ground. Those lights would make a target for thousands of paratroopers. The entire airborne assault depended on that precision. The stakes could not have been higher. Thousands of young men in the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions were about to jump into a hostile country. If they landed in the wrong places, scattered across miles of unfamiliar territory, their units would shatter before they could form up. Small, isolated groups would be hunted down by German patrols. Key objectives, bridges, crossroads, causeways, would remain in enemy hands. The whole invasion could fail before landing craft reached the beaches. Their mission was to draw a map in the dark, to give the main airborne force a chance to arrive as a cohesive army, not a terrified, disorganized mob. Every Pathfinder knew what failure meant. Men following them could fall into a slaughter, parachutes carrying them to certain death. It was a heavy burden for a small group of men. The mission felt impossibly heavy. The first problem was the weather. A thick bank of clouds had moved in over the English Channel, lower and more dense than the forecasters had predicted. This forced the C-47 transport pilots to make a difficult choice. They could not fly low and stay under the cloud cover. That would put them directly in the path of the most intense German anti-aircraft fire. So they climbed, taking their planes higher into the turbulent air. Flying higher meant the paratroopers would be in the air longer after they jumped. A longer fall meant more time for the wind to push them off course. The second problem was navigation. In the black of night, the Norman countryside became a confusing and featureless landscape. From the air, one hedgerow field looked exactly like another. Rivers and streams disappeared into the shadows. Roads became invisible. Small villages became invisible. The pilots were flying with the best instruments available at the time. Those tools were not perfect. A small navigational error, a single wrong turn made miles back, could send an entire plane load of Pathfinders 5 or 10 miles away. There was no room for such mistakes. The third problem, and the most terrifying, was the German defenses. As the planes crossed the coastline, the sky erupted. Searchlights cut through the clouds, hunting for the aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns, the dreaded German flak, began to spit fire. Shells burst around the planes, peppering them with shrapnel. Pilots were forced to take sudden, violent, evasive action, banking hard to dodge the incoming fire. Many jumped while their plane was still twisting through the air, completely unsure of where they were. These three problems fed on each other, creating a perfect storm of chaos. The bad weather pushed the planes higher. The darkness made navigation a guessing game. The intense flak forced pilots off their carefully plotted courses. The plan, which had looked so neat and orderly on a map in England, was coming apart in the hostile skies over France. The Pathfinders were being scattered by forces they could not control. They were falling into a darkness that was not just empty, but actively trying to kill them. Well, it was utter chaos. Then the flares ignited, too early. Red lights pierced the hedgerows. Green lights followed. Gunfire immediately tore through the night. The signal lights had given the German defenders a perfect target to aim at. Bright red tracers, bright green tracers. Mortar rounds began to fall, their explosions walking across the ground where the lights had appeared. The small, scattered teams of American Pathfinders scrambled for cover, pressing themselves flat against the earth, diving into the wet ditches that lined the hedgerows. There was no time to make a new plan. There was only time for immediate, instinctive action. Some Pathfinder teams decided their position was compromised and they had to move. They gathered what little gear they could and slipped away into the darkness. Others were pinned down by the intense enemy fire, unable to move at all. A few men could not find their equipment bundles in the dark. They were soldiers without their most important weapons, the beacons and lights. The precious minutes were ticking away. The main force of over 13,000 paratroopers was fast approaching. For one team from the 101st Airborne, the moment of decision had arrived. They had found some of their equipment, including the all-important Eureka beacon. But they were under fire. They could hear German voices shouting just beyond the next hedgerow. They knew that turning on the beacon would guide the planes, but it would also confirm their exact location to the enemy. They faced a stark choice. They could stay dark, stay hidden, and perhaps save their own lives. But if they did, the next wave of paratroopers would arrive blind. That failure would ripple outwards. Well, they had to choose quickly. These were Pathfinders. They chose to do their job. They chose to turn on the beacon. In a muddy ditch, a young radio operator, just 19 years old, lay flat on his stomach. He could feel the cold, damp metal of the radio case under his hands. He carefully tightened a knob. The Eureka beacon came to life with a low, steady hum, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence between bursts of gunfire. He could hear the distinct sound of German boots running on the wet grass nearby. Tracers sliced the air just above his head, lighting up the leaves for a split second. He buried his face in the dirt, kept his hand on the radio, focused on his task. He had to keep the signal going, no matter what. It transmitted a signal that could be picked up by a receiver in the approaching C-47s, a piece of equipment nicknamed Rebecca. The Rebecca gear did not show a map or give them a picture of the ground. It simply gave them a direction and a distance. It was a homing device, a single electronic thread stretching through the darkness. For the pilots struggling through clouds and flak, that simple signal was everything. It was a point of light in an ocean of black. The planes came. The steady drone of their engines grew louder. The paratroopers began to jump, their dark silhouettes blossoming against the gray pre-dawn sky. The main force had arrived. The landing was far from perfect. Wind and flak had pushed planes off course. Many men still drifted wide of the mark. But the beacon worked as a magnet, pulling planes toward the correct drop zone. Significant clusters of men landed near each other, 10, 20, even 50. Weapons and supply canisters also fell near these groups, where they could be recovered and used. Not a complete success, but usable, a center of gravity in the dark. As dawn broke over Normandy, the true picture of the airborne drop became clear. It was a picture of immense confusion and scattered fighting. Units were hopelessly mixed up. Men from the 82nd Airborne, men from the 101st. Privates found themselves leading sergeants. The carefully laid plans had dissolved in the fog of war. The battle for Normandy began not with a grand charge, but with small, desperate firefights in towns like Sainte-Mère-Église and along the causeways from Utah Beach. The Germans did respond, but their response was piecemeal and confused. They had reports of parachutists landing all over the Cotentin Peninsula. They could not figure out where the main American effort was concentrated and hesitated to commit their powerful reserve units. The Pathfinders, by creating even a small concentration of forces, had helped to keep the German response divided and delayed. Their achievement was not something you could easily capture in a photograph. No parades for a blinking beacon or simple landing lights. Their victory was quiet and structural. They did not win a battle in the traditional sense. They created the conditions for other battles to be won. They laid a foundation, however shaky, upon which the rest of the invasion could be built. This was not a clean victory. Many Pathfinders died that night. Many more were captured. The cost of being first was incredibly high. The paratroopers who followed them also paid a heavy price. Men died in their harnesses and alone in ditches, fighting against impossible odds. The loss was real and terrible. But because of what happened in that field, the overall plan did not collapse. The invasion held. There is an important lesson in the story of that night. Big battles are not won by brute force alone. They are won by timing, by structure, and by the courage of a few people making the right choice at the right moment. The Pathfinders were an elite unit, chosen and trained for a specific and difficult task. Turning on a beacon under fire did not win the war, but it shaped the battlefield. Their success was not about the enemies they killed, but the order they created. They were not the largest force to land on D-Day. They were simply the first. And being first in war is a unique and powerful position. You absorb the first shock. You take the first, and often the greatest risk. You set the frame for everything that follows. You can point the way, make the route usable, give the main force a place to start. That is what the Pathfinders did. We think of beaches, tanks, and big battles, but we should also remember the men in the dark fields. Remember the small teams working their radios by the light of explosions. Remember the young operator who tuned a simple knob while bullets flew over his head. He and his comrades did not win the war by themselves, but their courage kept the invasion from failing before the sun even rose. What they did was provide a foothold, small and precarious, but enough. The invasion began with a degree of control rather than in complete collapse. The Pathfinders did not make the landing perfect. They made it possible. Their success was not loud, it was structural. Training, reliable technology, and above all, human nerve. Sometimes the most important actions are the ones no one sees. The story of the Pathfinders is the story of how small things can change big events. History is not only made by generals with maps, but also by young soldiers with radios. That night, the fate of thousands did not rest on a grand strategy, but on a simple choice made in a dark field. The choice was to risk everything, not for glory, but for the sake of the men who were coming next. The courage to create a single point of light in an overwhelming darkness mattered more than anyone knew at the time. If you think the beaches were the hardest part of D-Day, wait until you see what happened inside Sainte-Mère-Église. That fight makes this one look organized. This is battle-born history. Fade.